Good afternoon. On today's Angry Alien Bulletin, in 1998, during an infamous mission where the Space Shuttle was constructing the International Space Station, a strange object was photographed by the astronauts and put out for the world to see without a great deal of explanation, at least at first. And ever since that time, this object, which has become known as the Black Knight satellite, has generated all sorts of conspiracy theories and stories about what it might be, how long it might have been there, and what its objective is. But in addition, this satellite has also triggered a lot of controversy and a lot of skepticism. And to make matters worse, a lot of truly terrible CGI, as the object has allegedly reappeared and reappeared for the ISS astronauts to see, sometimes even when they're not fully aware of it. So is there anything to this? Is this object just something that happened to float away from the space station while it was under construction, as NASA claims? And if that is the case, are there other examples that we can point to of objects that we know were lost from the International Space Station to do a reasonable comparison? And even if this is a completely mundane object, are there other objects in orbit that we can't quite so easily account for and might actually represent an extraterrestrial presence that's been sitting in plain sight for decades, if not centuries? Well, spoiler alert, there's a team of astronomers, respected astronomers who have peer-reviewed studies to back them up, who believe that this is indeed the case. And we're going to get to all of this right now.
T-minus 15 seconds. 12, 11, 10, 9, 8. We have a go for main engine start. We have main engine start. 4, 3, 2, 1. We have booster ignition and liftoff of the Space Shuttle Endeavor with the first American element of the International Space Station, uniting our efforts in space to achieve our common goals.
By the time the STS-88 mission came around, a lot of people probably weren't even paying any attention. It had been 12 years since the Challenger disaster, and things had gotten back to normal, even routine for the shuttle. There was very little indication that anything else was ever going to go wrong after NASA had fixed all of the problems with what had happened during that fateful Challenger launch in 1986. But of course, as we all know, just a few years later, Columbia would suffer yet another disaster, which would lead to the cancellation of the entire program. That being the case, though, this mission is not quite so well known to much of anybody except for UFO aficionados, because if you're into that sort of thing, you know that a strange object was discovered while the space station was under construction by the STS-88 crew, an object that was not immediately explained, and an object that got broadcast by all the major news networks. Now, as time went on, NASA came up with an explanation fairly swiftly, but that didn't satisfy quite a lot of people, given the fact that this object was very bizarre looking. Even today, as I look at this photograph, it just doesn't look like anything mundane. So I definitely think it's worth looking at these images and the theories that go with it with an impartial eye. So first of all, what does NASA say about all of this? Well, the STS-88 astronaut Jerry Ross pointed out that ISS was in the midst of being constructed when the images were taken. The US team, he said, was on its way to attach the American module to the one created by the Russians, and as part of that work, they had taken 4 trunnion pin thermal covers with them. The task was to wrap these around 4 4 bare trunnion pins, these being rods that attached the module to the Space Shuttle Endeavor while it was being transported. This would prevent heat loss from the exposed metal. And during one of the spacewalks where the construction was going on, things went a bit wrong, and one of these covers came loose from its tether, causing it to float away along with some other items. And the whole incident was actually recorded by NASA. Quote, "Jerry, one of the thermal covers got away from you," according to STS Commander Robert Cabana, and very soon they realized that the cover had been lost for good. And this is what was subsequently captured on camera, according to NASA and according to the astronauts who were on the mission. The object even has a catalog number, 025570, but it isn't in orbit anymore because it burned up in the atmosphere, as most objects do when they get ejected from the International Space Station, because its orbit is actually quite low. If the ISS doesn't receive regular reboost, usually from some sort of resupply spacecraft, the ISS would actually fall into the atmosphere and eventually burn up. Its orbit isn't high enough to keep it there. So that all seems like a pretty cut and dried explanation, but is it actually true? Or is this something that NASA might have been trying to cover up? Well, let's go ahead and look at some of the other stories attached to this conspiracy theory. Apparently, the Black Knight satellite is an object that's been in orbit for over 10,000 years, 13,000 years to be precise. Not really sure where anybody would get that kind of estimate or how we would know something had been there since the time of the Ice Age, but nevertheless, we've got that. Also, Nikola Tesla reported receiving strange radio communications that he couldn't explain at the time in 1899, and so he hypothesized that it was coming from Martians. Since that time, however, we've become very aware that strange radio background noise can be detected by a wide variety of instruments, and if you don't know what that background noise is, it can definitely be misinterpreted as signals from an alien civilization. So what else is it about this object that makes theorists talk about it having been there for a long time, watching the human race? Well, Donald Keyhoe in 1954 reported that the United States Air Force had spotted 2 satellites orbiting Earth, and in 1954 there were no satellites. Now, skeptics have pointed out that Keyhoe was promoting a UFO book at the time and felt that the story was being written tongue-in-cheek style. However, as you're going to find out later on, there's actually a considerable amount of evidence to support the idea of unidentified objects orbiting the Earth in 1954, but we'll get to that in a little bit. Now, since 1998, sharp-eyed observers have spotted a wide variety of objects flying through space in ISS footage, such as this footage recorded by Italian astronaut Samantha Cristoforetti, who also happens to be the love of my life. Okay, so now that I've embarrassed myself saying all of that, let's look at the footage. Apparently, we can see a bright object suddenly change direction in the background as it is maneuvering through space. But is this the Black Knight satellite making a return and pacing the International Space Station, or might it be something else? Well, as you can see, there's quite a lot of random debris on the ISS cupola, and also the ISS tends to eject a lot of crystals in the process of conducting its operations, whether you're talking about fluid dumps from the station, that sort of thing. Oftentimes you will have random ice crystals floating by the exterior of the station, and if thrusters happen to be in operation at the time, or perhaps some other venting from the station, that can cause a tiny object to change direction. And there's something else we need to keep in mind when we're talking about anything being observed from the ISS, if it's something that's visible, something that's tumbling about in space at roughly the same orbital speed as the ISS is going, that means one of two things. Either it's an object that's intentionally traveling as fast as the ISS, because orbital speeds are almost never the same, and if they are the same, that usually means that the object was launched from the ISS in the first place, as is the case with the footage that you're watching right now. This is a Russian experiment whereby satellites, CubeSats, very small satellites, are being launched by hand by Russian cosmonauts while they were performing a spacewalk. And as you can see, this object is tumbling, presenting its more reflective side to us periodically, very much in the same way as the so-called Black Knight satellite was doing, and many other objects that have been observed in ISS footage and mistaken for UFOs. It's very important that any observation that's being made from the ISS be done in context. We need to know when the observation was taking place and exactly what sort of operations were being carried out at the time. It's very likely that any object that's spotted in ISS footage is going to have a direct correlation to something the ISS was doing at the time. If it wasn't, then we might have something to talk about, but in this case, we really don't. So when it comes to the Black Knight satellite, here's my conclusion. Low Earth orbit is under continuous observation, and even though small objects a few centimeters in size can pass our notice, something that's large is going to be an identifiable piece of space debris that not only governments are going to keep an eye on, but also amateur astronomers. There's a wide variety of amateur astronomers who actually do their best to track everything that's in low Earth orbit, just to study the increasing danger represented by space debris and how that could eventually sabotage everything we're trying to do in space. But didn't I say that there was some evidence to suggest that there might be something else in orbit, something that isn't quite so easily explained? Well, yes, that is indeed the case. This is Dr. Beatriz Villarroel, and I want to apologize for butchering her name in previous videos. It's Beatriz Villarroel, at least that's how it was pronounced the last time I saw her interviewed. She is a respected astronomer, a member of the Swedish astronomical community, and she leads a team that has been studying photographic plates from the Palomar Observatory in California, taken way back in the 1950s. And you remember when I said that there was evidence to suggest that there might have been objects in geosynchronous orbit way back in the 1950s? Well, a series of these plates suggest that there were indeed objects that are not very easy to identify in orbit at the time. In 1950 and then again in 1952, a total of a dozen objects appeared in these plates that subsequently vanished. They shouldn't have been there in the first place, and then about 45 minutes later, they were gone. That is not something that could have happened with a supernova or passing asteroids or anything else. Instead, this had to have been some sort of object or series of objects inside the solar system, maximum 1 light year away, but probably a lot closer than that remained sufficiently stationary in order to appear in a time exposure photograph, but then relocated themselves in a mere 45 minutes, something that only an artificial object can do, at least as far as we know at this time. So Dr. Villarroel has concluded that these were objects that were probably in geosynchronous orbit in the 1950s, at a time when no human-made objects could possibly achieve that orbit. Indeed, Sputnik would not even be launched until the late 1950s. So it might have been the result of some sort of extraterrestrial technology that briefly appeared in orbit and then moved on. And if these objects were there at the time, they might have deposited something in geosynchronous orbit that has remained to this day, and something that has escaped notice. But is this possible? Haven't we identified everything that's in geosynchronous orbit? Well, no. Actually, a recent survey of space debris in geosynchronous orbit with objects that are roughly a meter in diameter, or even a little bit bigger than that, has resulted in a collection of objects, 75% of which remain unidentified. Now, the purpose of the survey was to try to determine how much the population of space debris was increasing in geosynchronous orbit, because this is going to be a really serious problem as time goes on, because objects in geosynchronous orbit don't go away. Their orbits don't decay to re-enter the atmosphere. They remain there forever, which means the more we increase the population of space debris in geosynchronous orbit, the more problematic it's going to be for anything we place up there. So Dr. Villarroel suggests that as we design spacecraft designed to deorbit these objects that are starting to accumulate in geosynchronous orbit, we also design them to identify what these objects might be and to keep their eyes open for an artificial object that we may not have constructed. And in addition to that, there is evidence to suggest that things have been spotted from the International Space Station that are not objects that were launched from there in the first place, such as the footage that you're watching right now from a Roscosmos cosmonaut who spotted something very strange indeed while he was taking time exposure footage of our planet's auroras. You may have seen them just move in the background. They'll be back here in just a moment. There they are, that grouping of 4 bright objects, 4 reflective objects in formation. These are not natural objects, and they're not objects that are traveling at the same orbital speed as the International Space Station. Now, they might be human-made satellites. Lots of people have explained these away as being Starlink satellites. However, they don't appear to be Starlink satellites. If you make a comparison between these objects and Starlink satellites that have actually been photographed from the ISS, there's a very big difference. Number one, Starlinks travel together in massive trains, not 4 at a time. Also, they're not nearly as bright as these objects are. These objects were even more reflective and perhaps even larger than Starlink satellites would be in order to show up as well as they did in that footage. And it's also important to note the timing. This footage was taken on August 13th, 2020. There was a Starlink launch on the 18th of August and a Starlink launch on the 7th of August, but no Starlink launches at a time when they would have been traveling in close enough formation to show up like this in this footage. And there's even more evidence to back up the fact that these were not satellites, at least not satellites that would have been launched at this time by any known space launch provider. And this is because at the same time that this cosmonaut captured these particular objects in orbit, somebody on the ground was filming them as well. An amateur astronomer who captured a grouping of 4 objects that should not have been there, objects that remain stationary enough to not appear as streaks in this time exposure series of photographs. Once again, that would not be conventional satellites, but rather objects moving either in geosynchronous orbit or in some other high orbit, and then subsequently disappearing from view later on. Again, he was unaware of the fact that these objects were there until he examined the footage later on. As I said, they appeared on the same day that this cosmonaut made his footage, and they look very similar indeed. As a matter of fact, I'm convinced that this is the same grouping of 4 objects that was spotted from the International Space Station. These are not Starlinks. These are not conventional satellites. These are something else. And yet it didn't stop the media from dismissing this discovery as being a grouping of satellites, something that, by the way, this cosmonaut was also instructed to say by his superiors in Moscow, even though he couldn't explain which satellites these were, when they were launched, why they were there. All he could say was his superiors told them that they were satellites, and I find that very suspect indeed. So what can we conclude from all of this? Well, I think it's very straightforward. You have to look at the context. You have to look at the time that footage is captured. You have to look at the circumstances under which footage is captured before you come to any sorts of conclusions. And this goes both ways. If you think you've seen a UFO in ISS footage, but you don't know the circumstances, then you need to know the circumstances before you come to any sorts of conclusions. And if, on the other hand, the news media or NASA wants to dismiss an ISS sighting as some sort of object that was ejected from the station or some sort of grouping of satellites, then the circumstances surrounding all of that also needs to be examined before they jump to these kinds of conclusions. And until we do what Dr. Villarol and her team suggests, actually make a serious scientific search for objects in orbit that we can't identify and shouldn't be there, objects that do not appear to be the result of human technology, until we actually make a thorough and scientific study and an unbiased one, an open-minded one for these types of objects, we may never know what might be in orbit keeping an eye on us. And even though a Black Knight satellite might be the result of a conspiracy theory with no evidence, that doesn't mean that we're not under observation. Thank you very much for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and also keep in mind that I have this very important conference in Milan coming up, and thanks to your amazing support, I've already raised more than half the money that's going to be necessary for me to attend it. It's a huge convention being attended by all the major players in spaceflight, including SpaceX, Blue Origin, ULA, everybody. And I am looking forward to attending this as a reporter, as a certified media representative for the first time. So excited about all of that. If you'd like to support it, all the details are in the description. Thanks again for watching, and as always, stay angry about space.